Story 1. The Breathing Body. I used to work the night shift as a morgue technician in a small hospital. It wasn't a job for the faint of heart, but I'd gotten used to the eerie silence, the cold metal tables, and the ever-present smell of disinfectant. Still, there was one night I'll never forget. It started like any other shift. Around 2 a.m., a body was brought in, a middle-aged man who had died of a heart attack. I logged him in, placed him on a table, and prepared to start the usual procedures. The room was silent except for the hum of the fluorescent lights. As I turned away to grab my tools, I heard it, a faint, shallow gasp. My heart skipped a beat. I whipped around, staring at the body on the table. His chest rose and fell ever so slightly as if he was struggling to breathe. I stood frozen, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Reflexes, I told myself. The body was just expelling trapped air. But then his hand twitched. Panic set in. I leaned over to check his vitals, but there was nothing. No pulse, no warmth. Yet his chest continued to rise and fall. Suddenly his eyes shot open. They were wide and bloodshot, staring directly into mine. I stumbled backward, knocking over a tray of instruments. As I scrambled to my feet, the man sat up, his mouth moving as if trying to speak. But no sound came out. He reached toward me with trembling hands, his eyes filled with terror. Before I could react, he collapsed back onto the table, completely still. I checked his vitals again. Nothing. He was gone. Shaking, I called the attending doctor, but when they arrived, the body showed no signs of movement. To this day, I can't explain what happened. The doctor dismissed it as my imagination, but I know what I saw. Sometimes, in the quiet moments of the night shift, I still hear that shallow gasp echoing in my ears. Story 2. The Whispering Cadaver. During my time as a forensic assistant, I often worked late nights in the morgue. The job was solitary, with only the occasional interruption from a security guard or a passing nurse. It was a peaceful kind of isolation, until the night I heard the whispers. I was cataloging a new arrival, an elderly woman who had passed away in her sleep. The room was silent except for the soft scratching of my pen against paper. Then faintly I heard it, a whisper. At first I thought it was coming from the hallway, but when I stopped to listen, it seemed to be coming from the body. My stomach churned as I leaned closer. The whispering grew louder, though the words were incomprehensible, like someone mumbling underwater. I backed away, convinced I was losing my mind. But the whispers didn't stop. They seemed to echo around the room, bouncing off the cold steel walls. I checked the body again, her lips were moving. My hands trembled as I stepped closer. "Are you alive?" I stammered, though I knew it was impossible. The woman's mouth continued to move, her whispering growing more frantic. Suddenly the room plunged into darkness. The lights flickered back on a moment later, and the whispers stopped. The woman's lips were still, her face frozen in death. I reported the incident to my supervisor, but they dismissed it as stress or fatigue. I left the job a month later, but sometimes in the dead of night, I still hear those whispers. Story 3. The Missing Toe Tag. One night, during a particularly quiet shift, I was tasked with organizing the records in the morgue. It was a tedious job, but it kept my mind occupied. I had just finished filing away a report when I noticed something odd. A body on one of the tables was missing its toe tag. Every body in the morgue was supposed to have a tag identifying it. I distinctly remembered attaching one to this particular cadaver, a man in his 30s who had died in a car accident. But now the tag was gone. I searched the area, thinking it had fallen off. As I leaned down to check the floor, I heard a soft thud behind me. I turned to see the body had shifted. The man's arm, which had been lying flat at his side, was now hanging off the table. My blood ran cold. I stared at the body, waiting for it to move again. When it didn't, I forced myself to approach. I gently placed the arm back on the table, my hands shaking. As I turned to leave, I heard another thud. The arm was hanging off the table again. I left the morgue that night and never went back. I don't know what happened to that body, or the missing toe tag, but I can't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Story 4. The Laughing Man. During my internship at a hospital, I was assigned to shadow a pathologist. Part of my duties included assisting in the morgue, which I found both fascinating and unsettling. One night, as we were wrapping up an autopsy, I heard something that made my blood run cold: laughter. It was soft at first, like someone chuckling under their breath. I glanced at the pathologist, but he didn't seem to hear it. The laughter grew louder, echoing through the morgue. It was a deep, guttural sound that didn't belong to any living person. I scanned the room, trying to find the source, but we were alone. Just me, the pathologist, and the body on the table. Then the laughter stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was deafening. As we cleaned up, I noticed the body's mouth was open slightly, its lips curled into what looked like a grin. I pointed it out to the pathologist, who shrugged it off as rigor mortis. But I knew better. That grin hadn't been there before. For weeks I avoided the morgue. But every time I passed by, I swore I could hear faint laughter coming from behind the heavy steel doors. Story 5. The Cadaver That Stood. It was my first night working alone in the morgue, and I was eager to prove myself. The shift started uneventfully, just paperwork and routine checks. But around 3 a.m., the lights flickered, casting eerie shadows across the room. I ignored it, chalking it up to the old building's faulty wiring. As I made my rounds, I noticed one of the body lockers was slightly ajar. I distinctly remembered closing and locking all of them earlier. Hesitantly, I walked over to close it. As I reached for the handle, the door swung open on its own. Inside was a cadaver, a man in his 50s who had died of natural causes. But instead of lying flat, his body was propped up as if he were sitting upright. My heart raced as I slammed the locker shut and backed away. That's when I heard it, a faint tapping sound coming from inside the locker. It grew louder, more insistent, like someone pounding to be let out. Terrified, I fled the room and called security. When they arrived, we opened the locker together. The body was lying flat, exactly as it should have been. I quit the job the next morning. Whatever happened that night, I knew I'd never feel safe in the morgue again.